This SvelteKit thing, that sounds pretty cool, right? Dude, SvelteKit is legit. Have you gotten a chance to play with it yourself? Yeah, I actually have a crash course where I build a really sweet Pokedex using the PokeAPI and SvelteKit. Dope. Do you think you can show me all about SvelteKit? Let's do it. All right, let's get into it. What's up, everyone? My name is James Q Quick, and I do weekly videos on web development related topics. One of those topics that I've been really excited about recently is Svelte. And I did a video a few weeks ago about why I like Svelte, and now I'm doing the SvelteKit crash course that I'm super excited about. Been working on this for a few weeks, so I'm excited to share it with you. In the meantime, if you're looking to follow me in other places, I'd like to share that I have a podcast called Compressed FM with Amy Dutton, where you can learn more about web development and design. And then I'm on Twitter, so if you want to hear about the new stuff I'm working on, I post frequently on Twitter, so check that out. But let's get down to it. SvelteKit crash course, let's go. All right, so as we dive in, let's talk a little bit about what we're going to build. We're going to build a Pokedex using the Pokemon API in SvelteKit. Now, I've done a video on building a Pokedex in JavaScript before, so I'll leave a link to that so you can check it out if you want to. But in this one, we're going to use SvelteKit. Now, we're going to cover a lot of different really cool topics like page routes, API routes, Svelte Stores, reactivity, searching, filtering Pokemon, server-side rendering, Tailwind CSS, and so much more. So you can see that this has a list of Pokemon. We can click on one to go and get a little bit more details about the individual Pokemon. So we have these dynamic routes for each one of these Pokemon. I can also search through Pokemon to find exactly the one I'm looking for. And then lastly, we have another page on here, which is the About page, just to kind of show off how this page routing works. Got a little bit of animations here on these individual cards. Anyway, I think this is going to be a lot of fun. I think it's going to teach us a lot about SvelteKit, which is in beta. So keep that in mind as we go through this crash course. This stuff might update or change soonish. So I will come back into an updated version of this course when it does. But let's take just a second to talk about what Svelte is. So Svelte is a front-end framework for building front-end applications that is really, really fast. So it will compile down to vanilla JavaScript, making those Svelte applications typically faster than what you see in React, Angular, and Vue. It also has a very simple syntax, which is much more similar to vanilla JavaScript than lots of other things out there. So people love it, one, because it's fast, and two, because it is just simple. The syntax is really nice. So then the question is, well, what is SvelteKit? Well, SvelteKit is a framework built on top of Svelte that is most comparable to something like Next.js for React or Next.js in the Vue ecosystem. And basically what it does is it gives you complete flexibility as a developer. You have access to creating static pages, you can do server-side rendering, and then additionally, you can do anything that regular Svelte can do for you as well. So that's what we're going to use in this. Again, keep in mind that SvelteKit is in beta, so some of the stuff might change in the future. And again, I'll update the course when we get there. So let's scroll down to the getting started here. And there's an npm init command that we can run in our terminal to go ahead and create a starter app. So I'm going to cd into my code demos, and then let me run this app, and let me call this SvelteKit Pokedex. And so what this will do is go ahead and create us a starter project, and it will ask us some things along the way. So do we want to generate a demo app, or do we want to start with a skeleton? In this case, we'll start with a skeleton because we're starting from scratch. We want to build this out ourselves. Ask us if we want to use TypeScript. I'm going to say no in this one, but you can obviously use TypeScript with Svelte and SvelteKit if you want to, which would be pretty neat. In this one, we're going to stick to vanilla JavaScript. Let's use ESLint for code linting, prettier for formatting, yes. And then looks like that stuff is good to go. So let's cd into the my SvelteKit Pokedex. And let's open that up in VS Code or whatever your favorite editor is. Get that thing open. Then we'll install the packages and we will run it to see what it looks like. All right, so let me run the npm install command here. That will take a second. While that's loading up, let's kind of look at what we have. And I had a pause a second ago because I had a version of Node that wasn't good for SvelteKit. So I had 12.17. It wanted 12.20 or greater, or 14.13.1 or greater. So I have just gone and switched over to using 14.13.1. Good thing for you to notice to make sure you have an updated version of Node on your machine that matches what SvelteKit is looking for. You can double check the documentation for what version you need, but in this case, I'm using 14.13.1. So now let me go ahead and run the npm install command again. This will go ahead and install all those packages. And while it is, we can take a look at some of the config files that are in here. We've got the ESLint RC. This is configurations for ESLint to give us some of those hints and linting errors inside of our editor. We have a prettier file. This will give us a little bit of details on how to format our code using single quotes, trailing commas. You can mess with these if you want to. We've got our JS config file here, and I think this is a good time to bring up the fact that SvelteKit uses something called Vite or Vit underneath the hood for the front-end build tool. And this is one of the fastest build tools that's out there right now. So its hot module replacement is super, super fast. I've heard more and more people rave about how fast this is. So we'll get to see this in a second. But it uses Vite as the build tool underneath the hood. And then we've got our Svelte config here. We don't really have anything we need to do in this one, just a configuration file for Svelte. And then inside of our source, we have kind of probably the stuff we're interested in. So we start inside of this routes folder, which has an index.svelte. So in Svelte, your components are .svelte files. And then in SvelteKit, you can put different files underneath a routes directory, and that will automatically serve them as routes. So let's go ahead and start to run this. Let's just double check in the package JSON, npm run dev. So let's run an npm run dev command. And I think by default, this will start out at port 3000, and I've already got my existing application, the finished one, running at port 3000. So let me close that and then let's start again. So this thing should open up at port 3000. Let's copy this URL and go ahead and paste it in. And here is our SvelteKit app. So just a little bit of basic information here that comes from this index.svelte. You can see if I were to say, welcome to SvelteKit updated, save, it refreshes super quick. Like there was no editing there. This just takes place really, really fast. Something like create React app sometimes, or maybe some of the other frameworks take a second or two to reload, which is not too bad, but it's not as fast as this. So this is a super fast, hot reload. We can see all of our changes take place here really quickly. So let's go ahead and add a little bit of information in here. This is actually going to be our SvelteKit Pokedex, and then we can add, and then we can just get rid of this paragraph tag. We'll add some more information here in a second. So again, the way Svelte components work is you can write just regular HTML in here. In a second, we'll see how we can do some script information. So we use a script tag just like you would in regular HTML. And then we can do anything we need to in here. So we can say hello world as a script. And then we can also add a style tag in here. So if we wanted to select our H1 and then say the color is going to be red, this is what everyone does by default when seeing if their CSS works. So inside of this one file, we should see that we're able to add CSS. So you can see that that works with this H1 here. And then also, if we look in our console tab, you should see the console log of hello world. So our JavaScript, our HTML, and CSS living all in one file here, which some people like, some people don't, but I think it works really well inside of Svelte with it just looking very similar to vanilla JavaScript. Now, one thing to mention with the CSS here is this is using scoped CSS. So what this means is that class or that selector is specifically applied to an H1 with this random class, and that class kind of represents this component, which means if we have another H1 in another file somewhere, this class will only apply to the H1 in the file that it's in. So it's scoped to this file, to this component. So let's take a look at what that means. Let's create a new file inside of our routes called about.svelte. And then let's add an H1 in here that says about. We'll add a p tag that says this is a really cool SvelteKit demo that uses the Pokemon API to build a Pokedex. So just basically some dummy information to kind of show how this works. Now, let's go and look to see if we go to /about, this has automatically created the other page for us. So two things to note. It's created this other page for us at the specific route. And then the H1 here is not styled red because, again, the styles in here are only applied to the component that they're in. So it's really important to know. Now, in a second, we're going to switch over and install Tailwind to do our CSS and styling that way. But for now, it is important to know that by default, your styles, if you write them inside of your components, are scoped specifically to that component. All right, now you'll probably notice that by default, the title up here is listed as localhost 3000/about and then just localhost 3000. What if we wanted to customize what is shown up there? So let's get rid of these styles, and we can use something from Svelte called Svelte Head. And you can see I'm getting some IntelliSense in here as well. So let's check out the Svelte Head, and then inside of there, let's add a title tag, and then let's call this the Pokedex. So this is the index page, and we can call it SvelteKit Pokedex as well. So if we save this and refresh, we should see that title update appropriately to SvelteKit Pokedex. And then we can copy and paste this over to the About page to change this one to About the SvelteKit Pokedex. So now those will have separate titles based on that Svelte Head. So that Svelte Head component, or this tag here, allows us to add any head information that we would in our regular HTML, so we get full control over what we want to add there. All right, let's do one thing. Let's start to create some components. So let's say we want to have a little bit of a navigation system to navigate between home and about. Well, we don't want the nav component to be a route itself, so we can create another folder called components, and this is where you'll create your kind of regular Svelte component. So let's call this nav.svelte. And then inside of here, we'll style this up in a second once we get Tailwind in place, but we want to have a nav, and then inside of there, we'll have two links. So we can use an anchor tag, and then the first one will just go to home, and this will say home. And then we can duplicate this and say about, and then do /about. Now we want this nav to be on every page. So one thing we could do is we could come into our index page, our index component, and we could import nav from, and then go back a directory to components, and then nav.svelte. So we could import it that way, and then we could put it at the top here. So this is similar to something like you would use in Angular React View. Hopefully this idea of pulling in components or importing components into now here, this page Svelte component makes sense. But let's go and see if this works. So there is our home about navbar, not looking great yet. We can navigate to about, but now on this page, it's not actually showing us that nav bar. So we want that nav bar to be on every page. So the way we can do this is inside of routes, we can create a new file, and it's __ layout.svelte. Now what this layout.svelte page will do is it will add whatever information you put in here, it will add it to every page. But the most important thing to do is to make sure that you include the slot. And let's see what that looks like in a second. If I save this, and I now go and look at our application, it's completely blank. That's because this layout needs to display the children, which are the page components. So we need to make sure we include the slot in here. So now if we save and refresh, we should see our regular information, but now we can go in and import that nav into our layout. So let's do a script tag, and let's import nav from components and then nav. And let's go ahead and display that thing. So we want the nav to be displayed above the slot, or the children components, the page components. So let's go ahead and add that nav first. And what we'll see now is we get two navs. And that's because we included it specifically in the index, which we don't want anymore. So let's get rid of this nav. Let's get rid of that import, save that. And now we should see we get our nav bar on both pages, home and about, and we can toggle between these pages. Now, another really cool thing about SvelteKit is if you notice, this is not doing a full page refresh as it switches between these pages. Svelte is actually intercepting these anchor tags. When it sees anchor tags that are relative to our project, it doesn't do a full refresh. It just kind of does the front end, the client side refresh, or the client side swap of the page. So there's no request back to the server. We can switch between these pages and no full refresh is happening. It's really nice that this does this by default using the regular anchor tag. Because if you did this in something like Next.js, let's look up links in Next.js, you have to use a specific component called next link. So you have to have this link component, which has the href, and then embedded inside of it is the actual anchor tag. That's kind of gross and a little bit confusing. It's not the end of the world, but it's not as optimal as now just using our regular anchor tags that we're used to. All right, now let's start to query some of our actual Pokemon data. And the way we're going to do this is with stores inside of Svelte. It's part of Svelte, and then you can access it inside of SvelteKit as well. So let's take a look at how to implement this. Now, at a high level, a store is a way to have kind of a centralized place to store data, in this case, Pokemon information that we want to use potentially in different components. We could give a new folder here called stores, and then we could call this file a Poke store. Now these store files are going to be JavaScript or TypeScript files. So this is just kind of regular JavaScript. Also neat that I named this Poke store because I guess it's Pokemart in the actual game. Anyway, if you're a Poke fan, you'll understand. All right, so inside of this Poke store, what we want to do is query the data from this Pokemon API. So I'm going to copy in this link here for the PokeAPI. It's PokeAPI.co. And then if you go to /API/Pokemon, you can pass it a limit for how many Pokemon you want to get the results for. So this is getting the results for the first 150 Pokemon. I'm kind of an original Pokemon purist where that's kind of where I focus. You could do more than that if you wanted to, but that's what we're going to do in this one. So that's where we're getting the data from. And again, if you want a reference to this, you can go to PokeAPI.co. And we're just going to pull in this information. Eventually, we will get more specific details for a given Pokemon, but for now, we just want the highest level details for the individual Pokemon. So let's create a fetch Pokemon function. And this is going to be an async function. And we'll just use the regular we'll use the regular fetch command or fetch function inside of JavaScript. So first I'm going to add in this URL. So I'm going to put that, just copy and paste that in. And then we're going to get the response back from making a fetch request to that URL. So that returns a promise, which is why we await it. And then from that response, we want to get the data. So we will await, and then we'll take our res and convert that to JSON or read it as JSON, because what comes back from this API, if we go back here, is JSON data. If you're wondering how I got this to be formatted, you can look for a JSON formatter inside of Google Chrome extension, and you can have your stuff looking really nice there. So we're going to do one thing with this data. If we look at the data that comes back, we just get the name and URL. And what I want to do is iterate through each one of these results and augment that information a little bit to add in an ID and then an image. And I'll show you how we get that in a second. So let's take our data. Let's say we're going to call this loaded Pokemon. And then we're going to take our data.results. And if you look inside of this return, see that all these Pokemon are listed inside of a results array. So we can do data.results, and then we'll do a map. And map in this case means we want to iterate through each item, each Pokemon, and transform it in some way. So we're going to get the data for each one and then the index as we iterate through. And then we want to return the new object, what we want the new object to look like. So our name property will be data.name. Then we'll have an index or an ID property, which will take the current index and then add 1. That's because indices in arrays are zero-based indexes. So we want to make sure that we increment that by 1. And then I'm going to copy in this for the image. Now what this is doing is I know from looking at the source code for the API, I know where the URL is, or the path is, for the individual images for the Pokemon. And what it does is it does this whole route, and then it adds in the ID of the Pokemon. So in this case, 1 is Bulbasaur. If we change this to 2, there's Ivysaur and Venusaur and so on and so on. So we're just kind of manipulating that string to add in the ID of the Pokemon that we're looking for. And so now we've basically got our fetch function, which formats the data in the way that we want. But how do we now expose this data to the different components? Well, in this case, we're using a writable in a Svelte store. So we need to import writable from Svelte. So we'll import writable from Svelte store. And then we want to create a piece of data that is writable that can be leveraged or accessed or used by other components throughout our application. Now you can translate this to something in the React world, like the context API or Redux or something like that. And then more specifically, something like using hooks with some sort of store in React. So we'll see what this looks like in a second. But first we want to designate or create this variable that is a writable, and it's going to start out, I think there's no E here, start out as an empty array. And so with a writable, what we can do is we can update its information, and then elsewhere in the code, we can read that information from it. So in other components, we can then read that information from that store, from that writable. So as we load this data, we want to take our Pokemon, that we just created, and we want to call a set. We want to call a set to pass in this loaded Pokemon. Now, not only have we loaded data, but it's also tracked in this Pokemon variable, which is a writable, which means someone else can go and listen to that data as it changes. Last thing we'll do is just make sure that we call this fetch Pokemon. Now that stuff should be ready. So we have this store, we have this writable, we're querying the information, we're loading the information for the Pokemon. Now, how do we get that information inside of our index page so that we can start to display them? Well, this is where we use some of the reactivity in Svelte, some of the stuff that I think is really, really nice and really, really well done. And I like the organization that Svelte has with these stores. So let's take a look at how we actually get this data. So we can get rid of our console log here, and then we can do an import of Pokemon from, we'll go back, go to stores, and then import this from the Pokestore.js. So with this Pokemon, you would think we could just log this out. Do we get this data? Is it what we think it should be? Let's take a look. Let's open the browser back up. Let's come back to our page and let's log this thing out. And I think we may have messed up. Oh, I think we need, this should be a named export, not a global, not a default export. So we need to put the brackets around it. And now you see we get back this thing. It logs out something that has a set, subscribe, and update function. Well, what is that? Well, remember, this thing is a writable. It's not just a piece of data. It's a writable that has data inside of it. So what we actually want to view the data is to prefix this with a $sign. Now, if we log this out, we should see all of our Poke data now is displaying. So what this $sign will do is it will not only kind of get the data out of that store, but it will also react. If for some reason that data changed, then this thing will react to that data. So let's look in, let's just scroll down and do a little bit of Svelte stuff here to show the names of those Pokemons. So the way we can do this in Svelte is using an each block. And what we're going to say is from the Pokemon, we want to get each one, get a reference to each one and reference it as Pokemon. So my cousin, who was a little bit older, would make fun of Pokemon and call him Pokemon. And then I realized, like, although he was making fun of stuff, it also, in this case, makes a little bit of sense because Pokemon is plural and singular. So to avoid confusion, Pokemon now is the individual Pokemon. And we want to make sure that we end this each block. So inside of here, we can use our bracket syntax to reference Pokemon.name. Let's just see if we get this to display here. Oh, and we made one very common mistake. As we mentioned, the $sign here gets access to the data. So we still need to reference this $sign as we do it in the each. And now we should see here are all of our Pokemon listed out, which is really neat. Now I want to show, I wonder if we can do this a little bit differently to show this reactivity. So as this thing changes, how do we, or as the data changes, how do we prove that Svelte is actually updating our UI? So I'm going out on a limb here for a second. I'm going to create another one. Actually, let's have this pass in a num, and let's put num inside of this. So this should still work if we pass in 150. All right, so we should still see the same list. That seems to work. And then what I want to do, just to prove to you how this stuff works, is I'm going to do a set timeout. This will take a callback function, and I want it to run after 3 seconds. And then after this set timeout finishes, after 3 seconds, I want to call fetch Pokemon again, but I only want to call it for 2 Pokemon. So what we hopefully will see is we'll see all this data listed, and then did you see that update? So let's maybe refresh this again. So it will query all the information, then 3 seconds later, it will query again for just 2. Now, the reason I show you that is that nothing changed inside of the thing that's reading that data. Because of this $sign, if any of the data changes from the Poke Store, this is automatically going to be re-rendered, which is really, really nice. This is a great way to share data across components, and it works out really sweet. So I actually don't need to pass in the ID. We're just going to leave this as 150. So let's go and put that back in by default and make sure this works. But I did want to show you just how that reactivity works in case that data were to change. Now you can think of this if you were building a to-do app, if you added a to-do, if you deleted a to-do, you could do that in one centralized place in the store and then see those updates take place in every other part of your app that you need to view it. All right, let's start to think a little bit about how we style this thing. And we're going to do that with using Tailwind CSS. Now, I found this article that I will leave a link to below. And it's a pretty easy setup, and it's very similar, honestly, to the setup you would use on a different platform. So we're going to install Tailwind CSS and Auto Prefixer. So let's close out our running app, and then let's paste in this command, which will install Tailwind and Auto Prefixer. Now, Tailwind CSS, if you're not familiar with this, is a utility-based framework, which has kind of just taken the world by storm. There's some people who don't like it as much, but lots of people, most people that I hear and see from, or I see talk about it, absolutely love Tailwind. I've become a big fan myself. It gives you a lot of structure into how you style your applications in terms of design patterns or design best practices. So you get this like scaled up effect of here's the different colors that you can use, here's the different margins and font sizes and that sort of stuff. And it works out really neat. So just if you've never seen this before, kind of stick around with me as we do this. If you have seen it before, it should be pretty familiar. And what we'll get to do is we'll get to take advantage of a new feature of Tailwind called the just-in-time compiler, which makes things a lot faster and does some pretty neat improvements inside of inside of Tailwind. And I would encourage you, if you're interested in those updates on the Tailwind CSS, there's a Tailwind Labs, I think, YouTube account. So Tailwind CSS JIT. There's a video that I watched to cover those specific announcements of what comes with it. So on the Tailwind Labs, there's the next generation of Tailwind CSS, and this talks about the just-in-time compiler. So I've watched a ton of the videos from Tailwind Labs. So if you're interested in learning more about Tailwind Labs, I would absolutely do that. So let's go ahead and finish the setup for Tailwind. We installed those packages, and then we need to create a postcss.config.cjs. And by the way, some of these files you'll see are in the CJS format to specify that they are common JS, as opposed to ESM modules. So this is more what we're used to looking at in Node, and we specify that we're using that format by prefixing this or naming it as a CJS file. So I'm going to name that file postcss.config.cjs, and then let's paste in this. So what this is saying is postcss will want to use auto prefixer, which prefixes our different styles based on different browsers. And then also we want to use Tailwind CSS, which we installed as a dependency as well. And then we want to create the Tailwind config file. And we can do this by running npx tailwind init. So npx allows us to run a package that we haven't installed ourselves. So it allows us to run Tailwind, it initializes it, and it creates the tailwind.config, again, looking at this being named CJS to define that it is a common JavaScript module. And then inside of here, what we want to do is we can get rid of the default stuff, and we'll do two things. We'll tell it we want to use the just-in-time compiler, and then purge says, hey, if we don't find a given Tailwind class in one of these files, we won't include it in our final product. So this is a way to really purge out the CSS that we're not using. So we're only using Tailwind CSS from Tailwind for classes that we have included in our project. So this is saying we want to look for those classes to be used in any Svelte file. So we'll give this a save. We can close out those two configuration files. And the last thing is inside of our layout, we need to install the base components and utilities from Tailwind. And we can actually do that inside of our layout here. So we can add at the bottom of this, we can add a style tag. And this is basically just saying we want to include the core things from Tailwind as part of our CSS. And this is more or less global since the layout is wrapping every single page. So this stuff will be available to us. And now we can start to use our Tailwind classes. So let's start this back up and let's see if it ran correctly. So if we start it up and then refresh, we should see that some of this will change a little bit, and actually a lot. So Tailwind CSS does a lot of resets. It will get rid of some of the default font sizes for H1s and bold and stuff like that, which may seem like a downside, but it's really neat when you actually get to have full customization over your application. So let's look at a few different things. Let's open up our index Svelte. Let's look at our header tag here, and let's start to add some classes. So in Tailwind, we want this text to be bigger. So we'll say text 4XL. We want it to be center, so text center. we'll do a margin Y of 8, and then we'll make sure all of this is uppercase. Now, the cool thing about Tailwind that I mentioned before, you have all these different sizes, text 2XL, 4XL, XL, medium, small, that sort of stuff. And then you have for margin Y, you have also margin X, or you just have margin. And then you have these different increments of how big or small that margin should be. And then you've got a really simple class here in uppercase to transform that text uppercase. So notice now that looks pretty good, more or less what we were expecting. So let's also open up our nav and start to style that in the same way. So let's open up our nav. Let's look at our nav bar, and we can use classes not only for just font size and colors and that sort of stuff, but we can also do things for how we display our information, including flexbox. So we can use flex here, which sets a display of flex. We can call justify center. That will center these items horizontally in the screen. And then we will do a W-full, which says that this nav bar should take up the entire width. So now let's go and see this, and those two things are centered, and the nav bar, if we look, is taking up the entire width of its parent. Now we want to add a little bit of styles for these anchor tags. So let's do 2 cursors here, do these at the same time. We'll do a class of mx-4. This is margin X of 4, so horizontal margin. And then we'll just do text of large. And that ought to get us a decent looking nav bar here. The one thing we are missing though is you see there's no like buffer around the top, and there's no padding on the outside of the content down here. And what we want to do is have basically a container that we wrap everything in. So since we're wanting to wrap everything, we can come into our layout and wrap the slot in a div with a class of P8, which adds padding all the way around. We'll do a max W 6XL, which says, hey, the max width, I only want to be whatever this arbitrary number is for 6XL, but only so wide. And then because it's only so wide, we want to do MX auto. So if you remember the margin 0 auto trick where you center things inside of itself, this will add some padding, set a max width, and then center all of its children inside of it. And then we'll close out this div and then make sure to wrap that div around the slot. So now this should be looking better and better. So we have our header up here, we have our nav bar, and I think we missed including the nav bar inside of our container. So let's go ahead and make sure the nav bar is in there. Now we have breathing room up there. We have some room on this side. And the last thing we need to do is update the same thing for our about page. So let's go to the index. Let's copy the styles here. Let's open the about page, add those same styles in here. And now this should be looking pretty consistent. So home, about, and then those titles are in the same place and they look the same. All right, so now let's look at how to actually display this information for the individual Pokemon in a little better way. And what we're going to end up doing is creating a Pokemon card, hint back to, or reference back to Pokemon cards, Pokemon card component in Svelte to display the information for each Pokemon. So let's go up to our components. Let's add a Pokemon or Pokemon card if we're using that to differentiate between plural versus singular. And inside of here, what we want to do is receive a property of Pokemon. So from the index page, it's going to render out a list of Pokemon cards. And to do that, it's going to pass the information for each Pokemon into this card component. So to receive props inside of Svelte, we do an export let and then whatever the variable name is, in this case, Pokemon. So if we do an export let, that means it's expecting to receive a property called Pokemon. Now in this case, we can add information in here to grab the Pokemon.name. So this should end up looking exactly like what we just had. Let's also close a few of these files and then open back up that index. So inside of here, now we want to import the Pokemon card from components and then Pokemon card. So we'll get that. And then instead of displaying this information directly, we will display the Pokemon card component and we'll pass in Pokemon to that component. Now what this does is it gives us a little bit of a way to organize the way where and how we display information. So we're now able to put all the information about a Pokemon into this Pokemon card. So let's save this. Let's do a refresh. This looks almost the exact same, except I didn't use a block element for the Pokemon name in here. So we could add this into a paragraph tag and then see that it should look the exact same. So a few things that we want to add in here. Let's get rid of this and kind of start from scratch. We want to have ultimately this be an anchored tag. And we want the href in here to go to a page that is /Pokemon/ and then on that Pokemon, we have an ID property. So we want that anchor tag to link to that specific route where we can find out more information about the Pokemon. And then inside of this anchor tag, let's add two things. Let's add an image tag, and this will have a source of Pokemon.image. That's that URL that we put into the Pokemon information. And then we'll have our alt here is going to be the Pokemon.name. So that'll be our image. And just to double check to show you where that information came from, inside of the Poke Store, we added this image URL that includes the ID of that Pokemon. So that's how we're getting this image. And then we can add an H2 in this case. H2 in this case. And we want it to have the Pokemon.id, do a period after that. And then we'll have the Pokemon name. All right, so let's save this and see what we got. So on the cards, now we at least see we have this stuff kind of laid out and displayed correctly along with the images, which is really neat. Now I'm going to copy in some styles. I'll tell you what these are doing in a second, but let's start with the anchor tag. And inside of the anchor tag, I want to add a bunch of styles. We'll add some padding here with P6. We'll add a background of a really light gray. We'll set the color of the text to be a pretty dark gray. We'll center that text. We will round the corners with border radius. We'll add a box shadow, small. Then we'll say when we hover, make that box shadow bigger, make it a shadow of medium. Then we'll set it to display a flex. We will set it to a flex direction of flex column, and then we'll center those items to make sure that vertically they're centered in the card. All right, let's say that and now see what we get. These are all just kind of, they're all just kind of stacked on top of each other, but they do have a little bit of what we would expect. So if I separate this one out a little bit, let's add a margin bottom to this one of 20 pixels. So now you can start to see what this will look like, but we want this to be a couple of items per page. So what we need to do is actually style the container for those different Poke cards. So in this case, let's go back to our index page, and inside of Poke card, or before we start displaying these Poke cards, let's add a div, and this will be the parent container for those cards. And then inside of here, we can start to use CSS grid. So we can call this grid here. We can set a gap of 4. We'll set gap top, bottom, left, and right. And then we can say that we want on medium and up screens, we want the grid calls to be 2. So we'll have 2 side by side on medium size and up screens. And then we'll have a grid calls 1 otherwise. So if we have a bigger screen, we'll put 2 side by side. If we're on smaller screens, we'll have just 1 side by side. And the last thing I want to do in here is give a little bit of Y padding in here for PY4. Now this should start to look a lot more like what we expect. So here are different cards. You can see them side by side. You see the little hover effect. You see the image and the name here. So we've got all the information that we wanted. I think I've got a few other classes I wanted to add to the actual Pokemon card or Pokemon card. So let's add on here. Let's do an H40 and then a width of 40. So this, I think we'll make that image a little bit bigger here. All right, so that looks good. And then on the H2, I want to set this to uppercase and then text to XL. Make that text a little bit bigger and uppercase. And now we're getting the full display of what we were looking for inside of our Pokedex. All right, now that we have that in place, I want to start to work on the filtering of these Pokemon. And this is a little bit tricky, but basically what we want to do is inside of our index page, we have a list of all of the Pokemon that come from the store, but we also need a list of which Pokemon are actually meant to be displayed as the user searches. So to do the search, we first need to define a variable inside of our script. So we'll have a search term in here, and we'll set it to an empty string to start. And then we'll also have an array of Pokemon that represents our filtered Pokemon. And I'm going to start that out as an empty array. And let's go ahead and work on the actual input here. So we're going to create an input underneath the H1. So an input with a type of text. We'll add a placeholder of search Pokemon. And then we'll start to add a few classes to style this up. So we will make this take up the entire width. We'll do rounded border radius, or we'll add border radius again. Do a text of large. We'll do a padding of 4, a border width of not 2 pixels in this case, but relative units inside of Tailwind. And then we'll set the border to a light gray of 200. By the way, I've got a Tailwind IntelliSense class that I have installed, or package that's installed in VS Code. So if you want some of that IntelliSense, you can install that as well. So let's go and look at this. Now we have our search. We can type in here and everything. Doing forms and binding to values in this case is much, much easier than something in React, because all we have to do two-way binding with that search term is called bind. And then we want to bind to the value property, and we want to bind with that search term. So what this means is nothing has changed yet, but if we give search term a default value of something random, that will automatically populate in here, which is really neat. Now, the other thing we need to do is somehow react to when the user types in something into the search term. So let's actually get rid of this. And now we need to think about reactivity. So as this piece of information changes, how do we then handle that change and do something with it? Well, Svelte has this really interesting syntax for $, and then brackets. And we can basically kind of use this as a function that will react to any data that changes that's referenced inside of it. So if we reference search term inside of here, anytime search term changes, this function will get rerun. So let's go and look at what this looks like. Looks like we've got a error in here. If we knew how to spell, we would have less of a problem. So let's log out the search term. And as we type, we should see now it's giving us that information. So this reactive function, basically, this reactive scope now is going to update anytime search changes. So let's take a look. If there is a search term, we want to search the Pokemon. Else, we can reset the filtered Pokemon to be the entire list of Pokemon that comes from the store. So we can grab our filtered Pokemon and set this to not Pokemon directly, but we need to make a copy of that data, and we can do that with the spread operator for arrays. So this will take a copy of each Pokemon from that Pokemon data and now put it into our filtered Pokemon, which now means instead of displaying or iterating through the list of Pokemon that comes from the store, we can iterate through our filtered Pokemon. All right, so if we look now, hopefully this will be the same. Pokemon is not iterable. That's because this needs a $. Again, a little tricky to get used to, but once you do, it works pretty well. So now we see the same list of Pokemon. We can type in here, but nothing changes. Well, now we need to say if there actually is a search term, then we need to say our filtered Pokemon is going to be the results that come back from searching through the full list of Pokemon. So we can use our Pokemon, and we can use a function called filter. And for each Pokemon, we only want to keep the Pokemon if the Pokemon if the name includes the search term. All right. So we're resetting the filtered Pokemon to be the Pokemon that we've searched for and found inside of the full list of Pokemon. So now if we do this and we start to search, we should Pokemon.filter is not a function, again, because of the $. Need to make sure that I do a better job of that. And now let's start to search for Bulbasaur. And I think for some reason, I just needed a page refresh there. So after I refresh the page and then start to type, it looks like it's good now. Now, the one thing to notice here is that only lowercase searches work because the name that comes from the actual data is lowercase. So if I search capital B, it's not going to find it. So the way we can do case insensitive searches in here is we can just convert each side, the name of the Pokemon in the data and the search term, to lowercase. So we can call to lowercase on the name and then to lowercase on the search term as well. So now I can search however I want. If I do capital B and nothing else, if I do all caps, that works. If I do lowercase, that works as well. Now, my favorite Pokemon is Dragonite. So there's a search for my favorite Pokemon in Dragonite, which I think is one of the coolest Pokemons that's out there. Charizard is another really cool one. Maybe it's just the dragon concept for me of Pokemon that I think is really neat. But that is the way that we can do our searching in here. We have all of our Pokemon that come back from the store. We then create a new array of filtered Pokemon and a search term. We bind to that search term so that anytime someone updates the information that's in the search box, it updates that variable. And then we do the reactivity here. So since we're referencing search term, this reactivity will trigger every time that search term gets updated, which then means we can update the filtered Pokemon accordingly. Pretty cool stuff. It's a little interesting, maybe a little weird syntax here, but the power of it is actually pretty neat. You can think of this as kind of a use effect in React. Use effect, you define your dependencies explicitly, and it runs that callback function every time those things change. This is very similar in the sense that it's now updating or rerunning every time that search term is changed here. All right, now let's start to look at how to create the individual pages for the Pokemon. So let's go into our routes. Let's create a new folder for Pokemon. And then inside of this folder, I want to create a dynamic route. So to do that, you do dollar, or not dollar sign, but brackets, and then the name of the parameter that you're going to be looking for. So this is ID Svelte. And what this means is we're going to use this page for any route that is /Pokemon and then /something. So inside of here, we want to display the details about the information, and we want to get those details from, I'll copy in this URL. We want to get those extra details that come from a separate API call to the API that has all this information. Now, we're only going to display a tiny bit of this information, but it's a ton more than what comes from our original call for Pokedata, which just has name and a URL, and then we added the image. So in this case, we want to make a fetch request. When someone gets to that page, we want to make that fetch request, get that information, and display it. Now, if we click on this, it should take us to Pokemon. Oh, we named the route Pokemon, but in here we called it Pokemon. So let's go back to our index, or actually the Poke card, and let's send this to Pokemon and then ID. So now we should be able to get to this page, although it's blank. So we can open up the ID route and just say, hey there. All right, so that will display something. More than likely, we want this to display an H1 with the Poke name. So we can add a placeholder here for Poke name. And now, how do we actually get this information? Well, one of the things that we can do in SvelteKit, which is really neat, is use something that's called server-side rendering, which in this case means that we're going to go and load this information before we actually display this component to the user in the browser. So that gives us the ability to go and query this information, pass that information to the component. So by the component is ready to display itself or be displayed, it already has all the details about that Pokemon. So the way we do this is we can do a script with a context of module, and then inside of this specific script tag, we can export an async function that's called load. All right, and this will take in a parameter of page. So this load function, what SvelteKit will do is it will look at this route. It will see that it has this export async function inside of a script that is a context of module, and it will call this load function before it actually lets that thing be rendered to the page. So what we want is we want to make an API call to the PokeAPI based on the ID of the Pokemon that we're searching for. And we can get that ID from page.params.id. So from there, we can grab the URL. I'm going to paste this in so I don't have to type it all the way. So the URL that we just showed, the PokeAPI / and then the ID of that Pokemon. We want to make the fetch request. So we'll do await fetch and then pass in the URL. Then we'll get the Pokemon data from the res.json. So we'll convert that response to JSON. And then what we do is return an object with props inside of it and then a property of Pokemon. So what this will allow us to do is run this query before we actually render this page. And then inside of the regular script tag for this, we can expect a prop or accept a prop of Pokemon. So again, what this will do inside of this context module, it will run this load function. It loads the Pokemon data. It returns that into this object, into the props, which means that the regular script in here is expecting a property of Pokemon. And now from here, we can actually use this to display the Poke name. So let's do brackets and then Pokemon.name. And if this works, we'll be making some really good progress. All right, so there is our Bulbasaur. If we went to /2, we could see that as well. So that is working really well, which is good. I'm gonna copy in a few of those styles that we did for our H1. So this will look a little bit bigger and more noticeable. So there is that. So there's Ivysaur. And again, if we went to 56, I don't know who that is right offhand. Mankey is 56. So we've got our dynamic routes, our server-side rendered routes with this load function that loads the information about that Pokemon and then starts to display this information. Now, this stuff is not going to be super detailed. So I'm going to copy in a little bit of this information. All right, so we'll just have the image tag again. We've seen the image before. And then we are also displaying the type, the height, and the weight. Now, again, you can have all the source code here, so you can go and grab all this. So you can type it yourself or grab it from the source code. And it looks like we're getting a little bit of an issue here with the type. And I think that's because there's a little bit of formatting we need to do to grab just the type, because it comes from Pokemon.types. You get the first type because they can have multiple. Then you get .type.name, which to me is a little confusing in how you actually get that information, but hopefully that will display now. So there's Mankey with the different properties and the image. And then lastly, we can wrap all this in a div that will center all of this information. So we'll do a display of flex columns and item center, and then close out that div. And now we've got our full details page for this Pokemon. So we can go back home. We can navigate to Ivysaur. Still shows our nav bar. We can go to Beedrill, go back home. So we've got server-side rendering for dynamic routes. We've got our regular homepage with all the Pokemon information. We can navigate between our two pages, and we can do a bunch of cool stuff. All right, one other thing we can do is we can start to convert the index page to use a similar format to what we just did. So I wanted to show off the Poke Store using Svelte Stores to show you how stores work. But in this case, we don't quite need it. We can actually just query this information in the exact same way that we did inside of here. So let's copy this script tag with the context of module. And let me paste this at the top here. And we'll have this load function where we'll go and query all of that data. And then instead of importing Pokemon from the store, we can export let Pokemon. So what we're doing here is we're going to query this data inside of this load function instead of in the Poke Store, so that by the time this index page is rendered, it already has all the information that it needs. So we'll just kind of grab all of this. So we'll grab that same logic, throw it inside of this load function. All right, let's save that. And then again, we need to return an object that has a props. And then it has inside of that props object has a Pokemon property that's set to loaded Pokemon. So that this gives us the ability to query all of this information before the page is actually displayed to the user. Otherwise, what we were doing was loading the page, querying the data, then displaying it. Now we're making sure that all this data is loaded before it actually gets to the user. And it comes through this props Pokemon after we've loaded it in here. Now, the last couple of things we need to do is get rid of all the $signs, because now this is not a writable thing. It's just a piece of data. So we can get rid of, I think it's just those two. So let's save this, refresh, and refresh this home page. Now we're seeing all the information again. We can click on Bulbasaur, see those details, Ivysaur, see those details, and then also hopefully continue to search for Charizard. Cool. So all of that stuff still works, but now we're getting this information from the server first to make sure that as we go to load this component, it already has all of that Pokemon information passed to it, so it's ready to go. Now, the last couple of things I wanted to show you was how API endpoints work. We're not actually going to use these in this case, but I wanted to show you how they work. And what I want to do is inside of routes, I want to create a new folder called API. And then inside of API, we'll create another folder called Pokemon. And then inside of there, we can have an index.js. And then we can also have another dynamic file, which is brackets ID.js. All right, so inside of the index, again, we're just kind of demoing this for how APIs work. I'm going to copy in, or actually, we don't have to copy it in. I can go through this. So inside of this API routes, what we want to do is export an async function called get. That means this is a get request. It's going to take in some params. And then at the end of this, what we want to do is return an object that has a status of 200 and then a body that passes along the Pokemon. Now, obviously, we don't have Pokemon here, so let's go and grab the logic from inside of here that calls the API and converts it to the format we want. Let's go and copy this and just dump it in here. So just copy and paste it because we've written it before. So save this, and now what we have is an API endpoint that's /API/Pokemon that should return all of that Pokemon in JSON data, or all that Poke data in JSON. So let's navigate to API/Pokemon, and it says Pokemon is not defined. That's because I think we called it loaded Pokemon. So let's just call this Pokemon here. And now if we refresh, we should see we get back all that data. Now we kind of just created a proxy that then calls another API, but I did want to show you how API routes work inside of SvelteKit. So we're able to do that, and then we can do more or less the same thing. Let's just copy all this. Let's then do this ID here, and let's name this one Pokemon. And we want to basically copy the logic that's inside of here. So we can copy all of this stuff where we go and query from that external, the third-party API. We want to do that based on the ID that is in here. And I think this is just params.id in this case. So we'll grab that ID, we'll throw it in there, and then we'll query that information and return it at the end. So another API endpoint. Again, the way where this comes from is creating a file inside of the routes directory that is JS or TypeScript file. And then it exports an async function. And in this case, it does a get to make this a get request. So let's try this out. Let's go to our browser, and instead of Pokemon, we'll do Pokemon/2. And hopefully this gets the information for Ivysaur. Cool. And then maybe 78. Anyone know who 78 is? I have no idea. Let's see who this is. It's a fire Pokemon. Rapidash. Yeah, there we go. Rapidash. Very nice. So this gives us the ability to create our own API endpoints. So if we wanted to call from our front end or let someone else call our API endpoints, they could. We have them listed in here. Again, not necessary for what we have set up here. Just wanted to show you that this is how it works. All right, so just want to show you one more thing in Svelte, and that is the built-in Svelte animations, which are pretty sweet. I haven't played around with these a ton, but I have done a little bit. So you can actually import these animations from, it comes from Svelte Transition, and you can see that auto populates there. What I'm going to do is just add a fade effect to these Poke cards. So that means that when the screen loads, it's going to fade these on, and then when the screen is either, or I guess just transitioning to another page, it's going to fade them off, which gives it kind of a cool transition effect. And we can add this fade by adding the tag or the property inside of the anchor tag, the transition : fade. And again, we import that fade from up here. It looks like we got another identity thing coming from Svelte, which we don't need. So we'll get rid of that. But all right, so let's go back to the application. And from the home page, if we go from Bulbasaur to its details page, or from the main Pokedex to the Bulbasaur detail page, you see those kind of fade out a little bit. And if we go back home, you can see those kind of fade in again. So a little subtle thing here, but I think having those transitions built into Svelte is really neat. And I'm looking forward personally to looking into those more. So I would definitely take a look at these transitions in Svelte. All right, hopefully you enjoyed that SvelteKit crash course as much as I enjoyed putting it together, which is a lot. Anyways, if you feel like you have any unanswered questions or topics that weren't covered in this video, let me know in the comments below and I'll follow up with extra videos. In the meantime, thanks as always for checking out the video, and I'll catch you in the next one.